All right, our next guest is Ben Kohlmann. Ben is currently a lieutenant in the United States Navy. He has a passion for discovering and discussing new trends and ideas shaping society. He's made numerous deployments overseas while attached to 2 carrier air wings and flew combat missions over Afghanistan between October 2009 and January 2010. Ben has facilitated the creation of numerous organizations dedicated to innovation within the military, particularly as created by those not often given a voice. These networks have created relationships across professions, linking up entrepreneurial-minded military professionals with their civilian counterparts. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Kohlmann.
Well, thank you all for having me today. Special thanks to Yinan for the invitation and the awesome venue we have. So what I'm going to talk to you guys today about is innovation and entrepreneurship within the military, and kind of under 2 rubrics. The first is the importance of intellectual curiosity, and the second is the importance of relational networks, which Rally Point really showcases. It's a story in 3 acts, and the first act begins in Vietnam. So this is a picture of my Uncle David, and Uncle David Wynn was a combat aviator in the Air Force. He joined up in 1941 to fly P-38s over Germany, and as a 19-year-old did that for 4 years. And after the World War II ended, he chose to stay in the Air Force and continued up his upward progression through the services. He was one of those individuals that I think we all have in our families that we all look up to, and he's kind of the scion of the family that we can kind of emulate and look to follow in his footsteps. So in 1967, Uncle David was a colonel in the Air Force flying the F-105 Thuds over Vietnam and was shot down and spent the next 5 years in the Hanoi Hilton. And as those of you who are familiar with the stories of the POWs in the Hanoi Hilton understand, this was an incredibly challenging time. He met some incredible people while there, but they were subject to some of the worst depravities that any enemy has ever beset upon their captors. Now, when he was in the Hanoi Hilton, he met a guy named James Stockdale. And James Stockdale was a Navy fighter pilot who had again flown in World War II, flew in Korea, and then also flew in Vietnam before being shot down in 1965. And Stockdale spent 7 years in the Hanoi Hilton. But prior to that, he took a fellowship at Stanford, and he originally was studying international relations. But while he was there, he happened to wander past a professor's open door, and he was a professor of philosophy, and sat down and started talking to this guy about life. And soon he became enamored of Roman philosophy, specific the philosophy of Epictetus and the Stoics. And so instead of doing this IR, Masters of International Relations at Stanford, which he ended up completing, he really focused most of his time on understanding the philosophy of the Stoics. And at the time, he didn't really understand or know how this would, shape his future life. But it really kind of created a bond within the Hanoi Hilton that got most of these 500 individuals who were shot down throughout the course of that war through those 5 to 7 years of hell. There was a book, I forget who wrote it, it was called When Hell Was in Session, and that really kind of encapsulated what those in the Hanoi Hilton had to go through. But while they were in the Hanoi Hilton, and through the leadership of Admiral Stockdale, they created the TAP code. Well, they didn't create it, but they really used it to its first true effect. And what the TAP code was really one of the first military social networks. So when you get shot down and you're taken prisoner by the North Vietnamese, they basically strip you of all your belongings. They take everything that's on your person, survival gear, boots, everything, and basically put you in your prison garb and throw you in the prison. Initially, it was with a cadre of 5 to 10 individuals, and eventually they'd potentially move you into solitary confinement and then start torturing you and beating you to get information. And what all of us who have been through SEER school, which is kind of the survival training that some of us receive before going overseas, understand is that all of us will break at some point. And mostly it's a psychological thing. There's physical harm that's beset upon us, but everyone has their breaking point. And after you break and reveal information, you're usually in a psychological sink. And it's very difficult to get back up to the level where you can be a functioning member of society. So what the POWs did is they created this network. So even if individuals were isolated in separate cells, they were able to communicate with each other. So they used the TAP code. And basically how it works is you use the shave and a haircut tap, so dut, 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 and that would be the indication that you were willing to talk. And communication between prisoners was prohibited in the prison, and if they violated or were found violating this procedure, they were again tortured and beaten further. But the individuals in the prison understood the importance of human interaction and communications. So they would use this tap code to bring in new members into their fraternity, into their society that they had created from nothing. And if you think about it, really they had nothing to start out with. They had just the clothes on their back and the people in their cells. They were in, the 20th century environment, thrown to the Stone Ages. And the phrase that Stockdale used when he was parachuting down was, "I'm leaving the land of technology and entering the age of the Roman philosopher." And this really encapsulated their experience there. So what they would do is a new entry to the prison would be brought in, thrown into the prison cell next to somebody else, and the prisoner who had been there for a while would start initiating this tap code. And they got so good at this that they could transmit entire messages, sentences, paragraphs throughout an entirety of the prison within an hour. They could tap up to 20 to 30 words per minute. And interestingly enough, as we look at this current age of Twitter, they kind of pioneered the abbreviations to make things short and concise. One of the most common was GBU, which stood for God bless you, or other things that would be succinct, quick, so they could transmit these messages across the prison. So after these prisoners of war returned, almost none of them had PTSD. And you think 7 years in captivity, 5 years of captivity in the most depraved conditions, there's got to be significant psychological things that would prevent these people from being integrated into their society. And there certainly were reverberations and minor things that did. But because of the social network and the cohesive environment that they had created within this prison, these people were resilient when they got back and were able to re-enter society. We see a lot of generals and admirals who came from these ranks. I mean, Stockdale himself ended up being a vice presidential candidate in 1992. They did an incredible job. But if you compare this to what happened when the Korean War veterans returned, when most of Korean War POWs returned, most of them had severe PTSD and had a very difficult time reintegrating back into society because they did not have that social cohesive structure that allowed them to be resilient. And it's really the social nature of these networks that allowed them to do so. And also, this ties back into the intellectual curiosity piece, in that Stockdale's leadership was derived almost exclusively because of the interest and exposure he had to philosophy and the role of Epictetus in building the Stoic philosophy, which guided the prison society in the Hanoi Hilton from 1965 to 1962. And again, this philosophy would never have been taught in a standard professional military education environment, because what's the relevance of learning about ancient Roman philosophers? Well, to our way of combat, there may not be. But as you can see in this particular instance, it had an outsized effect. So the Act 2 really talks about our generation. So over the past 13 years, as you all know, we've been at war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we found is that a lot of the individuals who deployed there, the things that they faced, they weren't necessarily trained to deal with. And it's not because they weren't trained appropriately. It's because the challenges that they were exposed to, there was no training for. So take a 24, 25-year-old platoon commander, company commander, who's been raised on fire and maneuver, raised on attacking Soviet columns, raised on the standard movement to battle. Well, when you get to Iraq and Afghanistan, there really is no defined line. There is no front lines. We talk about women in combat and some of the challenges therein. Well, for the women who were in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was no demarcation between these are the front lines, these are the back lines. They are in combat. And additionally, when you look at the things that the soldiers had to do on the ground, they had to be very entrepreneurial and innovative in coming up with solutions to these problems. So instead of merely leading a group of 50, 200 men into these environments, they also had to engage with village elders. And I was talking to someone earlier, talking about their experiences as a staff sergeant in these villages where they were the ambassadors. And I think the panelists mentioned that, is they were the ambassadors to these societies, far beyond just being leaders within their platoons. And having to create a thought structure and a plan to rebuild a society from scratch takes a lot of cognitive agility and takes some entrepreneurial tendencies to make that happen. So we see these 25 and 26-year-olds building up roads and building schools and helping to revitalize economies and helping to reshape societies that go beyond just attacking the enemy. One of my favorite stories from the Iraq War comes from General Mattis. And many of you know he was a famed Marine Corps officer who led the initial charge up through Baghdad. But while he was there was word of protests that were going to happen between two of the sects there. And the standard military procedure there is put everybody up in the up-upper Humvees, put on their body armor, get them well armed, put them in the middle of the streets, and kind of be the security on site in a very tense environment. And so what Mattis decided to do instead was he told his staff, I want you to go and and rent every single tour bus you can find and send it out to the desert for 6 hours on the day that this protest is supposed to transpire. And his staff kind of quickly looked at him and said, okay, well, you're the 3-star, we'll do whatever you want, but this doesn't make any sense. So they did, these buses drove around. And interestingly enough, this protest never materialized. This big, huge protest put on tens of thousands of people that was going to pit two warring sects together never came together. And the solution and the answer was, well, they didn't have the buses to get to the protest site. So instead of having to, put up walls of individuals to keep these warring parties away from each other, what if you just came up with a solution that prevented them from getting there in the first place? And that's the kind of intellectual agility that's required in 21st century combat. I just came back from an opportunity to work with DARPA over the past couple of weeks, and we worked on some really heady technological solutions for adversaries that may be out there. But I left leaving a little bit disillusioned in the sense that we are very focused on the far-term threat, on the very expensive threat, on the existential things that may or may not come to pass. But as I walked out of that building on that Wednesday, in the news we heard about ISIS running through Syria and Iraq, trapping tens of thousands of Christians on a mountain. We heard of Russia invading Ukraine, maybe invading them, maybe not, we weren't really sure. We heard about some incursions in Africa, an Ebola outbreak that had national security implications. And so while we're devoting intense resources to these really high-level ends of war, we're almost forgetting about the brush fires that are really defining our 21st national security environment. And I would posit and argue that the individuals that came out of these 13 years of war that had to be entrepreneurial and kind of push the envelope in terms of what they had to do on the ground are those perfectly suited to help solve these ambiguous national security situations, but they aren't necessarily being given the opportunity to do so. So this is the way the world looks to the United States military right now. We have very clean, defined lines. We have NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, AFRICOM, EUCOM. If something happens in Africa, EUCOM's probably not going to get involved. If something happens in China, NORTHCOM's probably not going to get involved. And this is a very clean, easy view of the world, and this is how most of our hierarchy is structured. But I would posit that our world actually looks more like this. And this is an image from 2010 that a Facebook intern named Paul Butler put together, where he took 10 million of their users and mapped in a graphically pleasing way the relationships between all these individuals across the world. And what I see in this map is really, in my view, how national security works now. So we have an Ebola outbreak in Africa. And that doesn't just affect AFRICOM. It affects the national security in NORTHCOM. It affects the national security in EUCOM. It affects the national security of whatever portion of the world those travelers may be going to. We have a security crisis in Iraq with ISIS. That is not necessarily an isolated Middle Eastern event. There are terrorist organizations that are linking up throughout the world trying to find advocates and allies in the different parts of the world. And so when we think about this networked age versus an information age versus an industrial age, this map of the world is very industrial age oriented. But we live in a world that's in the information age. And there has to be a new way to think about how we do things. So the third act is taking action. How can we make a difference? And the first thing that I'll point to is the democratization of information and the ability for young individuals to take action and make an impact. About 6 months ago, a guy by the name of Guy Bus Snodgrass, who's a fellow F-18 pilot with me, wrote a paper called Keep a Weather Eye on the Horizon. And this was a 32-page document that he put together in his spare time because he saw a critical shortage of talent staying in the naval aviation ranks. And he wanted to understand and figure out why this was happening. Why are some of our best and brightest aviators leaving the service, and what are the implications for future national security? So he had a lot of data in there, a lot of research, but what we didn't have was the really hard analytics of what could happen. So I saw this paper, and I immediately emailed him and said, Bus, what you said are the things that all of us have been thinking over the past 2 years. Let's figure out how we can continue to push this forward. So we got together, and with another guy named Chris O'Keefe, put together a Navy-wide unofficial retention survey. So most DoD retention surveys, or surveys of any type, take 6 months to a year to execute. They probably take 6 months to collect data, and maybe in a year or two you'll get results and put it out there. Additionally, they cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to execute. So they're not very efficient. But what we did is, in the matter of a month, put together an entire survey, got it on SurveyMonkey, vetted it through academics, both in the civilian and military side, and then disseminated it to the fleet. And between May 1st and May 30th, we had 6,100 respondents give data into this survey. And it asked everything from, do you want to stay in the military? Why are you leaving the military? What do you think about senior leadership? What are some of the concerns that are on your mind? How does your family view this? Things that most normal Navy surveys wouldn't ask. And our idea was to collect this stuff and then disseminate it for public consumption. So these are some of the data that we got in an initial first look. We're still kind of compiling the rest of it, and we're going to have a full report out here in a couple weeks. But there are some high points that I think are both illustrative of what's happening in the Navy, but also are instructive for what's happening in the rest of the force. So as you can see, people think they're making a difference in the military. So the first question on the top left, I'm making a difference. 44% agree, 16% strongly agree, and a minority disagree. They don't think they make a difference. So I think from the mission aspect, the military is doing well. We can convince the members of the services that they are having an impact. But where it gets a little bit dicey is when it comes to personnel retention and the view of the underlings to their superiors. So the one on the top right is, do you believe performance rankings are based more on timing or merit? And the answer was 64% think it's timing, which is seniority-based, not merit-based. 21% say both. 9% say neither. And only 6% of individuals in the Navy think that current fitness reporting systems and evaluation systems are merit-based. Now, this is a challenge for a society and a culture that is self-proclaimed, saying people are important and we need to retain our best and brightest. Because if we are unable to, even through our own evaluation systems, if we're unable to convince those that are being evaluated that's a fair system, there's going to be problems there. The one on the bottom is basically long-term career intentions, and interestingly enough to us, most individuals are planning to stay for at least through retirement. There are those who are going to leave, but most are planning to stay with some significant reservations. Another instructive question we asked is, do you want your boss's job? Very simple question. The presumption here is that if you want your boss's job, you're probably going to want to stay in the military and continue on. Whereas if you don't, your chances are you may want to leave. So we found that 49% said they don't want their boss's job, 39% said they do want their boss's job, and 12% said that they're not sure. So right now we have a plurality of individuals within the services that don't want their boss's job. And what we found is that's for a variety of reasons. A lot of it has to do with all the administrative burdens that are pushed down from above onto the commanding officers and the middle-level management that these junior officers see detracting from the mission at large. And so I think this, again, goes back to the industrial age versus information age construct that we have. We have a very hierarchical system that demands a lot to cover a lot of requirements put on by above, and it goes back to the zero defect and the risk-averse mentality we talked about with the admirals panel up here, the flag officer panel up here, is that the administrative requirements are really inhibiting kind of the ambitious, the entrepreneurial, innovative millennials from giving their full potential out there. And then finally, what's the trust level between the junior officers and senior leaders? So there's been a lot of discussion on the junior officer level about retention challenges and things that need to be made different. So you think that with all this milieu of discussion that there would be some higher level interest in taking action on this. Well, if you look at the statistics, the answer to the question, I believe senior leaders will take action based on the results of the survey, it doesn't look good. 28% strongly disagree, 34% disagree, 22% are neutral, and only 16% either agree or strongly agree. Now, it's hard to make change in the military. There's congressional requirements, there's budgetary requirements, and I work for a 4-star, and I've seen firsthand, even at the 4-star level, it's incredibly challenging to make a difference without working through the bureaucracy in the right way. So there's a huge disconnect between what senior leaders are perceived to be able to do and how the junior people are perceiving their service. And part of it's immaturity, but I think part of it is the junior officers who are used to taking action on their own aren't seeing the type of responsiveness they maybe expect from senior leaders. So one of the things I've always been a firm believer of is if there's an organization that you want to be a part of that doesn't exist, you should go out and create it yourself. And the reason I believe this is because a lot of people have a lot of good ideas, but not a lot of people execute on them. But those that do can get a community of interest together that will make a difference. And this really started for me about 3 years ago. I got to San Diego after a tour overseas in Afghanistan, flying off the carrier, and finally an instructor tour, kind of short tour, got the chance to lay low a little bit. And I met a guy named Brian Ferguson, who's ended up becoming one of my best friends. He was in training to become a SEAL at the time. And we sat down, one of our first meetings, at a bar in San Diego over Johnny Walker Black. And the question we had on our minds was, what can junior officers do to have an impact on national security? Because overseas, we were seeing a lot of these junior officers having significant impact, as I mentioned earlier, on the ground, rebuilding societies, making very difficult decisions airborne with, do I drop this bomb, do I not, what's the situation evolving below me? But there wasn't a lot of ability for them to influence the conversation once they got back into garrison or kind of put under the dictates of the larger military at large. One brief example I'll give you is I remember flying over Afghanistan, my last mission, and there was a firefight going on with some Afghan soldiers, and there was rockets being fired back and forth. We were seeing this from the 30,000-foot view, and we had to make a decision as to do we employ in this situation or not. And we ultimately chose not to employ because we weren't comfortable with the rules of engagement. So here I am, a 28-year-old who's making a life and death decision, and these were the type of decisions we were making on a day-to-day basis. So a lot of responsibility was placed on us. But when I got back to San Diego, one of the first things we came upon was an 06 commander who there was a alcohol-related incident in his command, over a couple thousand people in the Marine Air Group. His solution to this problem was to require all of us, no matter what your age or rank, if you wanted to go out on a Friday night after midnight and get a drink, you had to text your superior officer and tell him what your plan was, where you were going, how much you were going to drink, and what your plan to get home was. And the disconnect between the level of authority that we were given overseas, flying multi-million-dollar aircraft in an incredibly ambiguous life and death situation, versus being in garrison, really, to me, focused the challenges that a lot of the millennials are facing right now. Yes, accountability has to be there, but level of trust has to be there as well. So Brian and I were thinking, how do we create an organization that really kind of pushes forward these innovative thinkers? And we said, well, who are those in our generation that have made an impact? And the entrepreneurs. And I think that we look at 30-year-olds, 35-year-olds who have created organizations that are changing the shape of this world. And it goes beyond entrepreneurs, though. I look at 25, 26-year-olds in the NFL. You look at Tom Brady. You look at Aaron Rodgers. Both their mid-20s. They led teams to the Super Bowl championship in front of millions of people, winning the MVP for their respective teams. You look at guys who have been elected to Congress at 30 years old. You look at the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Michael Dells and those who are starting companies like Airbnb and Uber, who, again, late 20s, early 30s, are having a fundamental impact on the course of our nation, the course of our society. And yet the United States military, which has probably the largest pool of individuals of any employer in the world, where are the 30-year-old strategic geniuses? Where are the 35-year-old generals out overseas that are having a true impact? I believe that this cognitive surplus exists in our service. I believe that there are those who could lead a carrier battle group out into sea because I see this happening in every other industry in our society. So our goal was to try to get these individuals together and kind of get them thinking about how they could have an effect on national security at large. So the first one we created was called Disruptive Thinkers. And this was basically just a meetup group in San Diego. We get together to talk about military-related issues and innovation-related issues on topics that weren't normally going to be instructed to military personnel. So some of the things we talked about, biomimicry, which is basically taking what nature's done and evolving that into technology. Talked to architects about what their view of the world was and how they create a building from scratch. We talked to political consultants. How are they going about defeating political incumbents? We talked to those creating education startups and kind of disrupting the education model in their respective cities, get inner city school children to go from low-level achievers to going to Ivy League schools. And from this, we got this huge understanding of how the world is being shaped and how we could take some of those ideas from the civilian world and integrate it into our military cultures to create this culture of innovation that we believe would help shape the 21st century. So from that, it grew. We had a cell in San Diego, one in Austin, one in D.C., but we wanted to have something more robust. So a group of us from across the services, 2 Air Force junior officers, 2 Marine Corps junior officers, 2 Army junior officers, and 2 Navy junior officers, created an organization called the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum. And we created a TEDx Startup Weekend-like event. We could come together, have big thoughts on big ideas, and turn the normal defense conference on its head. So there would be no contractors there. There would be no uniforms. It would just be all the themes that matter with your ideas. And we would give the stage to emerging leaders who had big ideas and give them the opportunity to sell their ideas. But also have senior leaders there who were champions, who could take those ideas and build the structures from scratch to help them kind of bring those grassroots ideas into reality. We had 115 people show up last year in October in the middle of sequestration. They took leave, they paid their own way, and afterwards I said, this is the best defense event we've ever been to because I was an active participant and I got a chance to contribute. And really, when you look at this discussion about the millennials, the Gen Ys, Gen Xs, I mean, that's almost a moot discussion. People want to have an impact, whether they're 25, whether they're 55. They want to find a reason to exist within that organization. And we're trying to figure out ways to do that. And the final thing I'll point to is the CNO Rapid Innovation Cell. So from Disruptive Thinkers, I was invited to speak at a conference, and Admiral Terry Kraft, who was then at the time of Navy Warfare Development Command, was putting together a group of 15 junior officers and enlisted personnel to come up with new solutions for Navy problems. So that under the auspices of the Chief Naval Operations, the highest ranking officer of the Navy, he gave us funding and time to pursue things that would be of interest to us. So my project was putting 3D printers on ships. So this was something the Navy had looked at and had been doing for 20 years, but kind of in a maintenance setting. But we were the first ones to say, why don't we bring this technology to the waterfront, to the people who are actually going to be using it, and see what incredible ideas they can come up with. And to me, 3D printing is more than just the widget that's created. It's a way of looking at the world. If I can think of something, I can create it. If I have a problem, need a tool for it, I can come up with a solution. And if you link up these really ambitious, forward-thinking, forward-deployed warfighters with a technologist who can make their vision reality, you have an incredibly powerful combination there. So we put a printer on the USS Essex and got a lot of media play, got a lot of attention, and got a 3-star level action officer in the Pentagon to take it on board for further integration throughout the Navy. This was an idea some junior officers had, but because we had senior level top cover and those willing to take our ideas on, we were able to have a true impact. And so kind of to wrap it all up, I truly believe that even in this age of instant communications through networks like Facebook and Twitter and Rally Point, in-person interaction and communication is still vital to getting things done. The power of this event right here is going to be in the people that you meet. You're going to have speakers like me, panels come up and talk to you about what we think is important. But it's really going to be the networks you guys are creating right now through relationships that will hopefully foster further projects and actions in the future. So I really implore you, take this time, use what Rally Point has built to build those online networks, but also use those to create those interpersonal relationships that you can face-to-face have discussions with people with. So in closing, I'll just say this. If you think the world is going to be a dynamic place, think outside your normal view. Look at the things that are shaping our world in ways that you haven't yet understood. Go beyond what the military is teaching you and go explore those things and then meet people and collaborate to build solutions.